The Great Emu War. In the sweltering heat of Western Australia, during the final months of 1932, an unprecedented conflict unfolded, one so absurd that it would later be remembered with a mix of humor, disbelief, and embarrassment. This was the Great Emu War, a battle waged between man and bird, between soldiers armed with machine guns and flightless giants who refused to die. The origins of this strange war traced back to the aftermath of World War I. Thousands of Australian soldiers, returning from the battlefields of Europe, were granted farmland in the country's vast western plains as part of a government settlement scheme. The idea was to transform soldiers into farmers, bolster the wheat industry, and strengthen the nation's food supply. But reality was far less promising. The land was dry and harsh, difficult to cultivate even in the best conditions. Then came the Great Depression, which sent wheat prices into a nosedive, leaving these struggling farmers on the brink of ruin. And just when things couldn't seem to get worse, they did, because that was when the emus arrived. The emus had always migrated seasonally, but this year was different. Driven by drought and a desperate search for food, an estimated 20,000 emus surged into the farmlands. Towering at nearly 2 meters tall, built for speed with powerful legs, these birds were like feathered tanks, capable of running at speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour. They trampled through fields, feasting on crops and knocking down fences, allowing rabbits and other pests to invade and cause further destruction. Farmers were at their wits' end. They tried everything: scarecrows, dogs, and even attempts to herd them away. But nothing worked. Defeated, they turned to the Australian government for help. And the government responded with military force. The Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, approved the deployment of soldiers to handle the crisis, likely expecting a swift and decisive victory. To the government, it seemed a logical solution. They had an overabundance of machine guns left over from the war, and surely a few thousand birds would stand no chance against trained men with automatic weapons. The press was intrigued, and newspapers gleefully reported that the military was about to go to war against birds. In early November 1932, Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was sent to the front lines with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and a stockpile of 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The farmers looked on with hope as the soldiers arrived, ready to wipe out the feathery menace. They had no idea they were about to become part of one of history's most embarrassing military failures. The first encounter took place on November 2nd near the town of Campion, where the soldiers set up an ambush near a group of 50 emus. The machine guns were loaded, the birds were in range, and the order was given to fire. The air filled with the deafening rattle of gunfire, but the results were nothing like what they had expected. The emus, instead of panicking or falling in waves, immediately scattered in all directions. Their speed and unpredictable movements made them almost impossible to hit. Bullets struck the ground, cutting through the dust, but the birds simply kept running. A few were shot, but most escaped into the bush. The soldiers, stunned by the failed ambush, regrouped and tried again. A second attempt was made later that day, this time with the soldiers lying in wait near a dam, expecting the birds to return for water. But when the emus finally arrived, they didn't cluster together as expected. Instead, they spread out into smaller groups, moving too fast for effective machine gun fire. Again, only a handful were killed before the rest vanished into the wilderness. Determined not to be outdone by birds, Meredith and his men decided to take the fight to the enemy. They mounted one of the Lewis guns onto the back of a truck and set off in pursuit, hoping to mow down the emus while driving at high speed. But this plan failed in spectacular fashion. The terrain was too rough for a moving vehicle to maintain steady aim, and the gun jammed almost immediately. Meanwhile, the emus, seemingly unfazed, simply outran the truck. The operation was quickly becoming a farce. By November 8th, after 6 days of battle, the soldiers had fired around 2,500 rounds of ammunition. The number of confirmed emu kills? Only about 200. For every emu that fell, dozens more continued their relentless march through the farmland. Frustration mounted. One soldier later reported that the emus appeared to be using guerrilla tactics, darting in and out of range, dodging bullets like seasoned warriors. A particularly large emu was even said to have taken multiple direct hits, staggered slightly, and then continued running as if nothing had happened. Major Meredith himself later reflected on the bird's resilience, stating, "If we had a division of these birds, we could march against any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." With the mission turning into a costly disaster, the government decided to cut its losses. By December, the soldiers were withdrawn, leaving the emus victorious. The war was over. The birds had won. In the aftermath, farmers were left to fend for themselves. The government eventually introduced bounty programs that proved far more effective, and later massive exclusion fences were built to keep emus out of farmland. But the Great Emu War would never be forgotten. The conflict became an international embarrassment, reported in newspapers around the world. It was a moment of sheer absurdity, a trained military unit, armed with modern weaponry, bested by a flock of oversized birds. Over the years, it has been retold as a cautionary tale of underestimating nature, a source of national humor, and even a subject of video games, films, and books. The Great Emu War stands as a unique chapter in history, a time when man went to war against birds, and the birds won.